I always thought my life with Emily was a quiet masterpiece, painted in soft hues of routine and trust. 20 years married, 2 kids grown and off to college, a house with a sagging porch we swore we'd fix someday. She was my anchor, small, freckled, with hazel eyes that crinkled when she laughed. I'm James, a high school history teacher, not the flashy type, just a guy who likes his coffee black and his weekends predictable. Emily worked at the library, surrounded by books and whispers, her world as steady as mine, or so I thought. It started with a text. Not hers, mine. A buddy, Mike, sent me a blurry photo late one night. Is this Emily? I squinted at my phone. The image showed a woman in a dimly lit bar, leaning close to a man I didn't recognize. Her hair, that chestnut wave I'd run my fingers through 1,000 times, caught the light. I laughed it off. Nah, she's home grading papers, I typed back. But she wasn't. I crept downstairs, found the living room empty, her laptop closed on the coffee table. She'd said she was meeting a friend, some book club thing. I didn't check. Why would I? The next day, I asked her casually over breakfast. How was your night? She stirred her oatmeal, not meeting my eyes. Fine. Just the usual, talking about novels and sipping tea. Her voice was smooth, but there was a twitch in her jaw, a flicker I'd never noticed before. I let it go. Doubt was a stranger to me then, but that photo gnawed at me, a splinter under my skin. I started paying attention, her late nights, her sudden interest in exercise classes, the way she'd lock her phone screen when I walked by, little things piling up like unpaid bills. A week later, I followed her. It wasn't planned. I was driving home from school, saw her car peel out of the library lot, and something, instinct, maybe, made me tail her. She didn't go to the gym or a friend's house. She pulled into a motel, one of those seedy places off the highway with flickering neon signs. I parked across the street, heart thudding, watching as she stepped out in a dress I didn't recognize. Red, clingy, nothing like the cardigans she wore at home. A man met her at the door, tall, broad-shouldered, with a grin that made my fists clench. They disappeared inside. I sat there for 2 hours, staring at that door, my mind a tangle of excuses and dread. When she came home that night, she smelled like lavender and lies. Book club ran late, she said, kissing my cheek. I nodded, mute, my throat tight. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed proof, something solid to hold up against the life I thought we had. So I waited, watched, let the splinter fester. I started checking her phone when she slept, found messages she hadn't deleted. Can't wait to see you again. From a contact labeled, Book Guy. My Emily, my quiet librarian, was unraveling into someone I didn't know. And I was unraveling too, into a man who'd follow his wife to a motel and sit in silence while his world cracked open. The days after the motel stretched into a haze. I went through the motions, teaching kids about the Roman Empire, grading papers, nodding at Emily's small talk over dinner. But inside, I was a coiled spring, every creak of the house, every chime of her phone winding me tighter. I couldn't look at her without seeing that red dress, that man's hand on her elbow as they slipped into room 12. I needed to know who he was, what he had that I didn't. I needed to understand why she'd thrown us away. I dug deeper. Her laptop was my first target. She'd gotten careless, leaving it open one morning while she showered. I scrolled through her emails, found a thread with Mark. No last name, just a generic Gmail address. The messages were vague but electric. Last night was unforgettable. You're my escape. James doesn't suspect a thing. That last one hit like a punch. I was a fool in her story, a backdrop to her adventure. There were photos too, selfies of her and him, laughing in a car, her head on his shoulder. He had dark hair, a sharp jaw, the kind of confidence I'd never owned. I printed one, stuffed it in my desk drawer, a talisman of my growing rage. Mark. I had a name now. I cross-referenced it with her library contacts, her Facebook friends, nothing. Then I remembered her book club. I called the library, pretended to be a patron asking about the group. The clerk hesitated. We don't have a regular book club. Emily sometimes hosts one-off events, but not lately. My stomach sank. It was a lie she'd fed me for months. I drove to that motel again, asked the desk clerk if he'd seen her. He smirked, said he didn't talk about guests. I slipped him $50. Red dress, chestnut hair, I said. He nodded. Yeah, her and the guy. Regulars. Room 12. Regulars. The word echoed, hollowing me out. I started tailing her more, mapping her secret life. She met him at the motel twice a week, sometimes at a diner an hour away. I'd sit in my car, watching them through windows, her laughing, him leaning in, their hands brushing. Once, I saw her slip off her wedding ring, tuck it in her purse. That image burned into me, sharper than any photo. I wasn't just betrayed, I was erased. At home, she'd hum while cooking, ask about my day, play the wife I'd loved. It was a performance, and I was the audience she didn't respect. The splinter became a wound. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat without tasting bile. I'd lie awake, staring at her beside me, wondering how she could breathe so easily next to a man she'd gutted. I thought about confronting her, smashing that photo in her face, demanding answers. But that felt too small, too quick. I wanted more than tears or apologies. I wanted her to feel what I felt, the slow, suffocating crush of losing everything. So I planned. Not revenge yet, not fully. Just the beginning. I'd let her dig her hole deeper, let her think she'd won. Then I'd bury her in it. Time warped as I watched Emily's double life unfold. Weeks bled into months, each day a rehearsal for the husband I used to be. I'd smile at her jokes, mow the lawn, fix the leaky faucet she'd nagged about, all while carrying that photo of her and Mark like a stone in my pocket. I'd study it at night, tracing their smiles, memorizing the way her eyes lit up for him. It wasn't just the act that clawed at me. It was the joy she gave him, joy she'd stopped giving me years ago. I'd been a fool to think our quiet life was enough. I needed more on Mark. I hired a private investigator, a grizzled guy named Pete who smelled like stale cigarettes and didn't ask questions. I gave him the photo, the motel details, the diner's address. Find out who he is, I said. Pete called a week later. Mark Hensley, works construction, lives an hour west. Married, no kids. Been meeting your wife for 6 months, maybe more. Married. That stung extra. Emily wasn't even his only betrayal. Pete sent me a file. Mark's address, phone number, a grainy shot of him with his own wife, a blonde with tired eyes. I wondered if she knew, if she sat in her own car somewhere, watching her world fracture too. I drove to his house once just to see. It was a squat ranch-style place, faded siding, a pickup in the driveway. I didn't knock, didn't confront him. I just sat there, imagining him inside, maybe calling Emily while his wife cooked dinner. The symmetry of it, 2 marriages rotting in tandem, almost made me laugh. Almost. Instead, I took a photo of his truck, its license plate clear in the dusk light. Evidence, I told myself. A piece of the puzzle. I'd started collecting things, receipts from her purse, a motel keycard she'd left in her coat, timestamps from her book club nights, a dossier of her lies. At home, Emily grew bolder. She'd come back late, her cheeks flushed, her excuses flimsier. The girls wanted to grab dessert, she'd say, or, I lost track of time shelving books. I'd nod, pour her wine, play the oblivious husband. But I saw the cracks. Lipstick smudged on her collar, a faint musk that wasn't her perfume. She didn't notice my silence, my stares. She thought she was untouchable, that I was too dull to suspect. Fueled me, that arrogance. I let her think she'd mastered the game, let her pile lie upon lie. The higher she built, the harder she'd fall. One night, she slipped up big. She left her phone on the counter, unlocked, while she showered. I scrolled fast. Texts from Mark, plans for a weekend getaway. Tell James you're visiting your sister, he'd written. I've got us a cabin. My hands shook as I read it, the casual way they plotted around me. I forwarded the thread to my email, deleted the evidence from her sent folder. She'd never know I'd seen it. Not yet. I put the phone back, my mind racing. A cabin. A whole weekend. It was bold, reckless, perfect. I'd let her go, let her sink deeper. Then I'd strike. Emily's sister visit came up casually over dinner. "I might head to Sarah's next weekend," she said, twirling spaghetti on her fork. "She's been asking me to come up forever." Sarah lived 3 hours north, a convenient alibi I'd heard before. I nodded, sipped my water. "Sounds nice. Tell her hi." She smiled, relieved, oblivious to the storm brewing behind my eyes. I'd already checked. Sarah hadn't posted about any visit on social media, hadn't called Emily in months. It was Mark's cabin, not Sarah's house. I knew it, and soon I'd use it. I called Pete again. "She's planning a weekend away with him. Some cabin. Find it." Pete grumbled but got to work. 2 days later, he texted me an address. An isolated spot in the woods, rented under Mark's name. "Cash payment, no paper trail to her," Pete said when we met. "They're careful, but not careful enough." He handed me photos. The cabin, a one-story shack with peeling paint, surrounded by pines. Secluded. Perfect for them and for me. I thanked him, paid him double to keep quiet. This wasn't about confrontation anymore. It was about control. I let the week play out. Emily packed a bag Friday morning, humming as she folded clothes I knew weren't for Sarah. "I'll call you when I get there," she said, kissing my cheek. Her lips felt cold, rehearsed. I waved as she drove off, then got to work. I'd taken the day off, told the school I was sick. My real job was ahead. I packed my own bag, tools, gloves, a burner phone, things I'd bought in cash from hardware stores miles apart. I wasn't sure what I'd do yet, but I knew it'd be cruel, precise, something they'd never forget. I drove to the cabin that night, arriving after dark. Their cars were there, her sedan, his truck, parked side by side like a mocking tableau. Light glowed through the curtains. I heard laughter, clinking glasses. I stayed in the shadows, watching. Emily stepped onto the porch once, wrapped in a blanket, her hair messy, her face soft in a way I hadn't seen in years. Mark joined her, pulled her close. I gripped my steering wheel, knuckles white, but I didn't move. Not yet. I needed them comfortable, settled. I needed the moment to be right. I spent the night in my car, a half-mile down the road, plotting. By morning, I had a plan. Not violence, not chaos, but something colder, sharper. I drove into town, bought supplies. A cheap camera, locks, chains, things that wouldn't trace back. I called Mark's wife from the burner phone, using a voice changer app I downloaded. "Your husband's at a cabin with another woman," I said, giving her the address. "Go see for yourself." She didn't say much, just hung up. I smiled. The first domino was tipped. I'd let her crash their little paradise. Let Emily feel the shock of exposure. But that was only the start. Saturday stretched long and tense. I parked near the cabin again, hidden by trees, watching the pieces move. Around noon, a blue SUV rolled up. Mark's wife, I assumed. She stormed out, blonde hair wild, face twisted in fury. She banged on the door, screaming his name. It swung open, and there was Emily, pale, clutching a sheet. Mark stumbled out behind her, shirtless, stammering excuses. The wife didn't listen. She lunged at him, then at Emily, a tangle of shouts and shoves. I snapped photos from my spot, the lens catching every raw second. Emily's eyes darted, panicked, as she realized her lie was crumbling. The wife left after 20 minutes, tires spitting gravel. Mark chased after her, yelling, but she didn't stop. Emily stood on the porch, alone, trembling. I could have gone to her then, revealed myself, but I didn't. I wanted her to stew, to feel the weight of her unraveling. She went inside, and I waited. Mark returned an hour later, head in his hands. They argued. I heard it through the thin walls, her voice shrill, his low and defeated. Good. Let them turn on each other. I had more in store. That night, I crept closer, silent in the dark. They'd left a window cracked, probably for air. I set up the camera outside, angled to catch the bed through the gap. It recorded sound too, every whisper, every move. I didn't watch long, just enough to know it worked. By morning, I had hours of footage, a digital dagger I'd wield later. I retrieved it before dawn, slipped back to my car. They'd never know I'd been there. Not yet. Sunday, Emily came home. She looked drained, her smile forced. "Sarah's doing great," she said, unpacking. "We had fun." I nodded, asked about the drive, played my part. She didn't mention the wife, the fight, the cabin. She thought she'd dodged it all. I let her think that. Monday, I uploaded the footage to a private server, edited it, her face clear, his too, their voices unmistakable. I didn't send it yet. Timing was everything. I called Pete one last time. "Find out what Mark's wife does next," I said. He reported back Tuesday. She'd kicked Mark out, hired a lawyer. Emily didn't know yet, but her lover's life was imploding. I smiled at that, a cold, quiet thrill. She'd feel it soon, her betrayal rebounding, her world shrinking. I wasn't done. The locks and chains in my trunk weren't for Mark. They were for her. For a revenge so cruel she'd never see it coming. I just needed the right moment. Emily's mask held firm in the days after the cabin, but I saw the strain. Her hands trembling as she poured coffee, her laugh a little too loud at my lame jokes. She thought she'd weathered the storm, that Mark's wife showing up was a hiccup she could smooth over. She didn't know I'd orchestrated it, didn't know I had footage that could shred her life with a single click. I let her settle into that false calm, let her think she'd outsmarted fate. It made what came next sweeter. I spent those days refining my plan. The camera footage was gold, but it wasn't enough. I wanted her to feel trapped, not just exposed, caged by her own choices. I dug into Mark's life next, using Pete's contacts. He was crashing at a buddy's place now, his wife filing for divorce. I found his construction company's site, called Pretending to be a Client, got his schedule. He was working a job 2 towns over, long hours, distracted. Perfect. I'd use him too, weave him into her punishment. But Emily was my focus, her betrayal was the deeper cut. At home, I started small, testing her. I'd leave my phone out, unlocked, with fake texts from a friend, hinting I'd been out late. "You're home early, good night?" one read. She'd glance at it, frown, but say nothing. I'd catch her watching me after, searching for cracks in my routine. She was paranoid now, her guilt turning inward. Good. I'd drop vague comments too. "Saw a red dress in the thrift store window, reminded me of you." And watch her flinch, her excuses piling up like damp leaves. She didn't suspect I knew, just that I might. That uncertainty was my first weapon. I drove to the hardware store again, bought more supplies, heavy-duty padlocks, a thick chain, a portable speaker. Cash, always cash. The clerk didn't ask, just rang me up with a bored nod. I stored everything in the garage, buried under old paint cans Emily never touched. She'd stopped going in there years ago, said it smelled like mildew. It was my space now, my war room. I'd sit out there at night, sketching ideas. Not violence, not blood, but something sharper. Humiliation, isolation, a slow unraveling she couldn't escape. One evening, she slipped again. Her phone buzzed while she was in the shower. A text from Mark lighting up the screen. "Wife's gone crazy. Need to see you." I didn't forward it this time. I replied instead, mimicking her tone. "Same place, tomorrow night?" He sent back a thumbs up. I deleted the thread, put the phone down. She'd go to the motel, find him waiting, and I'd be there too. Not to confront, but to tighten the noose. She came out toweling her hair, smiled at me. I smiled back, my mind already at room 12. The motel night loomed like a shadow. I told Emily I'd be grading papers late at school. A lie she swallowed with a peck on my cheek. "Don't work too hard," she said, her voice light, her bag already packed with that red dress. I nodded, left first, circled back after dark. She pulled out at 7 p.m., headlights cutting through the dusk. I followed, keeping distance, my heart a steady drumbeat. The motel lot was half empty when she arrived. Mark's truck was already there, parked crooked. She slipped into room 12, and I waited, my car tucked behind a dumpster. I'd brought the speaker, the chains, the locks, my toolkit of ruin. I crept closer, set the speaker under their window, connected it to my burner phone. The footage I'd recorded at the cabin was queued up. Hours of their whispers, their laughter, her voice calling his name. I hit play, kept the volume low at first, just enough to seep through the glass. Inside, I heard a pause, then Mark's gruff, "What's that?" Emily's reply was muffled, tense. I turned it up, let her own words fill the room. Undeniable, intimate, a mirror to their betrayal. They burst out minutes later, Mark shirtless, Emily clutching her purse, eyes wild. "Someone's out there," she hissed, scanning the lot. I ducked low, watched them scramble. Mark checked the speaker, yanked it free, smashed it under his boot. Too late, the seed was planted. They'd know someone had proof, someone was watching. I slipped away, drove home, waited. She stumbled in at midnight, pale, claiming a friend emergency. I asked no questions, just poured her tea, let her stew in her own panic. She didn't sleep that night. I heard her pacing, muttering. She thought it was Mark's wife, maybe a PI. She never suspected me. The next day, I called his construction site, used the burner again. "Tell Mark Hensley his truck's got a flat," I said, voice disguised. He'd leave work, check it, find nothing. Another nudge to fray his nerves. I wanted them rattled, jumping at shadows. Meanwhile, I printed stills from the cabin footage, her face clear, his too, dozens of them. I didn't mail them yet, just stacked them in the garage, a growing arsenal. Emily started locking her phone again, checking the windows at night. She sensed the walls closing in, but she didn't know how tight they'd get. I tested her again over dinner. "Heard a weird noise last night. Someone outside?" Her fork froze midair, eyes darting to mine. "Probably a raccoon," she said, too quick. I shrugged, let it hang. She was unraveling, thread by thread, and I was the one pulling. The chains in the garage weren't for her body. They'd lock something else, something she'd built her life around. I just needed one more push to set it all in motion. Emily's paranoia bloomed over the next week. She'd jump at every creak, glance over her shoulder pulling into the driveway. She stopped meeting Mark. I checked, tailed her to work, saw her stay late at the library for real this time. He'd texted her. I knew, because she'd left her phone out once. A rare slip. "We need to lay low," he'd written. "Someone's onto us." She'd replied, "I know. I'm scared." Good. Fear was a start, but it wasn't enough. I wanted her broken, not just spooked. I shifted focus to her sanctuary, the library. She'd always called it her happy place, where she'd shelve books and chat with patrons, her quiet kingdom. I'd take it from her, turn it into a cage. I started with the stills, those damning cabin shots. I mailed a batch to the library, addressed to her boss, no return address. The note inside was simple. "Thought you should know who Emily really is." I didn't sign it, didn't need to. The photos spoke loud enough. Her in Mark's arms, laughing, oblivious. I sent another set to Mark's wife, just to keep the fire burning. Her boss called her in 2 days later. She came home red-eyed, silent, slamming drawers as she made dinner. "Rough day?" I asked casual. She nodded, muttered about staff drama, didn't elaborate. I knew the truth. Pete had a friend at the library, fed me the details. Her boss had confronted her, shown her the photos, asked for an explanation. She'd stammered, claimed they were old, a misunderstanding. He didn't fire her, not yet, but the whispers started. Colleagues stared, patrons avoided her desk. Her happy place was souring, and she couldn't trace it back to me. I upped the ante. I'd kept one of her library keys. She'd lost it months ago, never suspected I'd found it. Late one night, I let myself in, moved things. Books off shelves, her chair flipped, a coffee mug shattered on the floor. Not enough to scream break in, just enough to unsettle. She found it the next morning, texted me in a panic. "Someone messed with my station." I replied, "Weird, maybe a prank." She didn't buy it, but she didn't push. Her world was tilting, and I was the unseen hand. That weekend, I locked the garage door with one of the padlocks, told her I'd lost the key. "Need to keep it secure, heard about break-ins," I said. She shrugged, distracted. Inside, I rigged the chains not for her, but for her car, her escape, her freedom. I'd wait for the right moment, strand her when she least expected it. She'd feel the walls close in, her life shrinking to a pinpoint. I smiled at her over breakfast, planning the next cut. The library fallout spread like damp rot. Emily's hours got cut. Her boss cited budget issues. But Pete's contact said it was the photos. She'd become a liability, a whispered scandal among the stacks. She'd come home frazzled, snapping at me over nothing. Burnt toast, a sock on the floor. "I don't need this too," she'd hiss, then apologize, blaming stress. I'd nod, play the patient husband, all while tightening the screws. She didn't know her sanctuary's collapse was my doing, didn't see the threads I'd pulled. I struck her car next. Sunday night, while she slept, I slipped into the garage, looped the chain through the steering column, padlocked it to a beam. I left the keys on the counter, let her find it herself. Morning came, and she screamed my name from the garage. "James, what is this?" I feigned shock, rushed out, stared at the chain like it was alien. "I don't know. Someone broke in?" Her eyes widened, hands shaking. "This is crazy. Who's doing this?" I shrugged, called the cops for show. They came, took a report, said it was odd but low priority. She bought a new lock for the garage, but the damage was done. Her car was useless, her mobility clipped. She started taking the bus, her routine fractured. I drive by the stop sometimes, see her hunched against the wind, clutching her bag. She looked smaller, diminished. At home, she'd ramble about feeling watched, targeted. "It's not random," she'd say, voice tight. "Someone hates me." I'd squeeze her shoulder, murmur, "We'll figure it out," hiding my grin. She was right, someone did hate her. Me. But she'd never guess, not yet. I let her flounder, let the isolation sink in. Mark reached out again. I saw the text when she left her phone charging. "Wife's got a PI now. We're done." Emily didn't reply, just deleted it, her face crumpling. Her lover was gone. Her job was slipping. Her car was a prisoner. I piled on. Left a library book on the table, one she'd recommended years ago, with a still tucked inside. She opened it, gasped, dropped it like it was hot. "Where'd you get this?" she demanded. "Found it in the garage," I lied. "Old photo of us?" Her silence was thick, her lies tangling. She thought I was clueless, but the doubt was eating her. I mailed more stills to her sister Sarah, her parents, our kids. Not all at once, a slow drip. Sarah called her, furious. "What's going on with you and this guy?" Emily denied it, claimed a stalker, but the cracks showed. Our daughter texted me, confused. "Mom okay?" Aunt Sarah's freaking out. I played dumb, said I'd check. Emily's web was collapsing, family turning on her, and I was the spider at the center, unseen. By midweek, Emily was a ghost of herself. Pale, jumpy, barely eating. The library put her on temporary leave. A polite shove out the door. She'd sit on the couch, staring at nothing, her phone silent now that Mark had vanished. I'd catch her muttering, "Who's doing this?" under her breath, like a prayer with no answer. I'd bring her tea, sit close, let her lean on me. The husband she'd betrayed, now her only anchor. It was delicious, that irony, her clinging to the man dismantling her life. I locked her in next, not physically but close. I'd bought a second phone, spoofed Mark's number, sent her a text. "Meet me tonight. Diner, 8 p.m. Last time." She bit. Didn't tell me. Just said she was running errands, and left on the bus. I got there first, parked across the street, watched her wait. He never showed, of course. I'd made sure of that, called his buddy's place, faked a job emergency, kept him away. She sat there an hour, alone, checking her watch, then walked home in the rain. I beat her back, greeted her soaked and defeated with a towel and a, "Where've you been?" She mumbled about a friend, her eyes hollow. The photos hit our kids hard. Our son called, voice shaking, "Dad, what's this about Mom?" I sighed, said, "I don't know, buddy. I'm as lost as you." He didn't buy it fully, But he didn't push. Emily overheard, confronted me, her first real crack. "Did you send those pictures?" she demanded, voice shrill. I met her gaze calm. "What pictures?" She faltered, backed off, doubt gnawing at her. She couldn't prove it, couldn't face it. I'd planted the seed, her family fracturing, her kids pulling away, all while I stood innocent. I chained her car again, this time in broad daylight, left a note. "You can't run." She found it, screamed, called me at work. "James, it's worse. Look at this." I rushed home, played the shocked husband, promised to beef up security. She clung to me, sobbing, "I'm losing everything." I held her, whispered, "I'm here." My voice steady, my mind cold. She didn't see the final lock coming. Not a chain, but a revelation, one I'd save for last. Her life was mine to crush now, and I'd savor every second. Emily's collapse was a slow bleed, and I watched it with quiet satisfaction. She barely left the house now. Her job gone, her car chained, her family distant. She'd shuffle around in slippers, eyes sunken, muttering about whoever's doing this. I'd catch her staring at me sometimes, searching for something. A hint, a tell. I gave her nothing but kindness, a shoulder to cry on, a cup of tea when her hands shook too much to pour. She leaned on me harder, unaware I was the architect of her ruin. I turned the screws tighter. I kept her library key, used it again one night. This time I didn't just rearrange. I left a message. On her old desk, I taped a still from the cabin footage, her and Mark Midlaff, with "You can't hide" scrawled in red marker. I trashed the place too. Books scattered, her chair slashed, a chaos she'd feel in her bones. The next day, her old coworker called her, voice trembling. "Emily, someone broke in. Your desk. It's personal." She hung up, ran to me, sobbing, "They won't stop." I held her, murmured, "We'll get through this." My voice a velvet lie. Her phone became my next tool. I'd spoofed Mark's number before, but now I went broader. Texts from Sarah, Mom, even our kids, all fake. "How could you do this to Dad?" One read, "We're done with your lies." Another, she'd reply, frantic, "It's not true." But the real numbers never answered, just my ghosts. She stopped checking her phone after a while, left it dead on the counter. I'd charge it, keep the barrage coming, let her think her whole world had turned. She didn't suspect the burner in my drawer, the app twisting her reality. I mailed the final batch of photos to our neighbors, the PDA she'd once chaired, her book club friends who'd never existed. No note, just the images, her betrayal in full color. The whispers reached her fast. One neighbor stopped by, handed her a print with a curt, "Thought you should know this is out there." She slammed the door, sank to the floor, shaking. "Everyone knows," she whispered. I knelt beside her, feigned shock. "What's going on, Em?" She couldn't answer, just wept. I'd stripped her bare, not with fists but with exposure, a public unraveling she couldn't outrun. That night, I locked the front door with a new padlock, told her it was for safety. She nodded, numb, didn't question it. She was a prisoner now, not of chains, but of shame, fear, a life I'd shrunk to these four walls. I slept soundly beside her, dreaming of the final blow. Emily stopped fighting the tide. She'd sit by the window, staring at nothing, her hair unwashed, her voice a rasp when she spoke. "I don't know who I am anymore," she said once, eyes on me, pleading for something, comfort, answers. I gave her a sad smile, patted her hand. "You're still you," I lied. She wasn't. I'd taken that from her identity, her pride, her peace. She didn't know I'd sculpted this shell, but she felt its weight. I brought Mark back into play. He'd faded from her life, but not mine. I tracked him down, still at his buddies, a wreck of a man, divorced and broke. I called him from the burner, voice disguised. "Emily's falling apart. She needs you. Meet her tomorrow. Old diner, 6 p.m. He hesitated, then agreed, desperation in his grunt. I texted her next, spoofing his number. One last time. Diner 6. Please. She read it, bit her lip, didn't tell me. She left that evening, bus ticket in hand, hope flickering in her eyes. I followed. At the diner they met. Awkward, broken. She begged him to fix it, to explain, her voice cracking through the window where I watched. He shook his head, said, "It's over. We're cursed." She cried, he left, and I snapped photos, her alone, defeated, the final nail. I mailed those too, to everyone she'd ever known. Captioned, "This is who she is now." She came home late, drenched, silent. I asked no questions, just handed her a towel. She didn't meet my eyes. I locked more, her bedroom window, the back door, each with a padlock she couldn't open. "Keeping us safe," I said. She nodded, listless. I'd turned our home into her cell, her car still chained, her world a shrinking box. She didn't call Sarah, didn't reach out. Her bridges were ash, burned by my hand. I'd overhear her whisper to herself, "I deserve this." And I'd smile, unseen. She was right, but she'd never know why. The footage was my ace. I'd saved it, unshared, until now. I edited it down, her happiest moments with him, her voice bright, carefree. I'd use it to break her fully, a mirror to what she'd lost. I waited, let her settle into this half-life, let her think the worst was past. It wasn't. Emily's days blurred into a gray fog. She'd shuffle from bed to couch, barely eating, her clothes hanging loose. I'd cook for her, coax her with soup, play the doting husband. "You'll feel better soon," I'd say, knowing she wouldn't. She'd nod, sip, stare at the wall. Her phone stayed off now. I'd killed it with my ghost texts, left it a brick of bad memories. She didn't ask for a new one, didn't ask for much. She was hollow, and I'd carved her that way. I set the stage for the end. I bought a small projector, cheap but functional, hid it in the garage. The footage was ready. Those cabin hours, her laughter, her whispers to mark. I'd play it for her, not to expose, but to crush. I waited for a quiet night, rain tapping the roof, her on the couch with a blanket. I locked the doors, the windows, told her, "Movie night. Something special." She shrugged, too tired to argue. I set the projector up, aimed it at the living room wall, hit play. Her voice filled the room, bright, alive, saying things she'd never said to me. Her eyes widened, hands clutching the blanket as she saw herself with him. Happy, whole. "Turn it off," she rasped, but I didn't. I stood behind her, silent, watching her watch herself. She tried to stand, stumbled, fell back, tears streaming. Where'd you get this?" she choked. I didn't answer, just let it run, hours of it, looping her joy, her betrayal, a relentless echo. She covered her ears, begged, "Please, James, stop." I didn't. When it ended, she was a heap, sobbing, broken. "You knew," she whispered. I nodded, finally spoke. All of it, every lie. She stared, mouth open, no defense left. I leaned close, voice low. "You built this. I just finished it." She didn't fight, didn't scream, just curled tighter, a wreck I'd made. I turned off the projector, left her there, locked the room behind me. She'd stay, trapped by shame, by me. The next day, she didn't speak. I'd won, her life was rubble, her spirit dust. I'd keep her here, a prisoner of her own making, my revenge complete. Emily didn't recover. The footage broke something deep, a crack no glue could mend. She stayed in that locked room for days, only leaving when I let her, bathroom, kitchen, back to her cage. I'd bring her food, water, sit across from her in silence. She wouldn't look at me, her eyes fixed on some nowhere point. "Why?" she asked once, voice a thread. "Because you chose him," I said, calm, final. She didn't argue, just shrank smaller. I kept the house sealed. Padlocks on every exit, her car still chained, a monument to her fall. Neighbors stopped knocking, friends stopped calling. The photos had done their work. Her name was mud, her life a whisper in town. Our kids didn't visit, didn't call. My lies to them held, their mother a stranger now. I told them just enough, twisted just right. She's not well, needs space. They believed me, trusted the dad who'd never faltered. Emily had no one left. A check on Mark II one last time. Pete said he'd moved, taken a job upstate, a shadow of himself. I sent him a still, him and her laughing, mailed anonymously to his new address. A reminder, a scar. He'd feel it too, though he wasn't my focus. Emily was. I'd turned her world inward, a prison of memory and loss. She'd try to speak sometimes, start a sentence, James, and stop, the words dying in her throat. I'd nod, leave, lock the door. Her library called once, offering her job back. Pity, maybe. She didn't take it, couldn't face the stairs. I answered for her, said she was unavailable. Hung up. She overheard, didn't protest. Her fight was gone, drained by the projector's light, by my quiet cruelty. I'd stripped her bare. Not with chains, but with truth, with shame, with isolation. She lived, but not really, a ghost in my house, my creation. I slept easy now, the storm spent. She'd betrayed me, and I'd buried her alive. Not in dirt, but in this life I'd crafted. It was enough. Months passed, and Emily faded into a routine of nothingness. She'd sit by the locked window, tracing the glass with a finger, her breath fogging it briefly before it cleared. I'd watch her sometimes, this woman I'd loved, now a husk I'd hollowed. She didn't ask to leave, didn't beg for the locks to come off. She'd accepted it, the house, the silence, me as her keeper. I'd won, not with noise or fury, but with a slow, cold grind. I kept the footage, the photos, locked in a safe she'd never find. Insurance, maybe, or a trophy, I didn't need to decide. She'd seen enough, felt enough. I'd catch her staring at the wall where the projector had played, like it was still there, looping her past. She didn't cry anymore. Tears were a luxury she'd run out of. I'd bring her tea, sit with her, play the husband still. You okay? I'd ask, knowing the answer. She'd nod, a reflex, nothing more. The town moved on. Her name faded from gossip, replaced by fresher scandals. Our kids called me sometimes, asked about her in vague terms. She's resting, I'd say, and they'd let it go. Sarah sent a letter once, angry, accusing. Emily didn't read it, just handed it to me, blank-faced. I burned it, told her it was junk. She didn't care. Her world was this house, these walls, my rules. I'd taken everything else. Her job, her lover, her family, her freedom, and left her this. One night she spoke, a rare spark. I'm sorry, James. Her voice was soft, cracked. I looked at her, saw the woman I'd married briefly in those hazel eyes. I know, I said, no warmth, no forgiveness. She nodded, turned away. That was it, her last try snuffed out. I locked the door behind me, left her to her shadows. She'd live with it, with me, until time took what little she had left. I'd rebuilt my life around her ruin. Teaching, coffee black, weekends quiet again. The porch still sagged, but I didn't fix it. It fit, somehow, this broken thing we'd become. She'd betrayed me in a way I'd never imagined, and I'd answered with a revenge colder than I'd known I could muster. Not death. I couldn't choose that, wouldn't, but a living end, a cage of her own making, locked by my hand. It was cruel, it was complete, and it was mine.